Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mike and Davina, and today my guest is Chris Basford. If you're not familiar with Chris, Chris is a Canadian-born producer, engineer, and mixer who's worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. He's worked with bands like Nickelback, Shinedown, Rob Zombie, Motley Crue, Avril Lavigne, and so many others. And actually, before we started recording this episode, we were just chatting, and it turns out that we actually grew up like basically next door to each other. Like our neighborhoods were so close, and he was only a couple years older than me, but we even have some common friends too. So small world, but it was great to get the chance to talk with Chris. And Chris has just such incredible mixes. If you've ever listened to any of the Nickelback mixes, or even the Avril Lavigne stuff, or the Rob Zombie stuff, like these mixes just sound so polished and so big and so clear. And so in this interview, we get into that, and we talk about Chris's approaches for how to make mixes sound wide, how to get guitar tone, how to make your drums slam and hit real hard, and have that clarity without sounding muddy. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. Chris does an amazing job of detailing his process, and I think there's a lot of great lessons to learn from this episode. So let's not waste any time. Let's just jump right into the interview with Chris Basford. Chris Basford, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. And we were just chatting before off air, and it turns out that we're like basically neighbors growing up. So like a small world. Pretty
much, yeah. We've definitely seen each other walking down the street and had no idea for sure.
It's amazing. Well, thanks again for taking the time to do this. For people who might not know your story, how did you get into audio, and how did you get to ultimately where you are now?
Well, if we go back kind of to the beginning, I've been kind of into music, quote unquote, since I was a little kid. My mom and my dad listened to a lot of, pop and rock, and there's lots of pictures of me as a toddler playing toy guitars and stuff like that. And I've always been very captivated by music and listening to music. And I, even when I was really young, I, had a little Care Bears record player that I used to play my dad's, vinyl on and stuff like that. So I kind of naturally, as I got a little older, wanted to play instruments. My dad and both my mom and my dad played instruments in like, marching bands and school bands and stuff like that. But so I kind of started getting interested in the guitar when I was a kid. Took some lessons and kind of was like, I don't really like this. And I was kind of got more into sports. And then when I became a teenager, I kind of went back and I started getting into guitar again. This time, like, electric guitar and, distorted amps and stuff like that. And so putting together bands and, later elementary and early high school, played in some rock bands. And, as we were talking about off air, I was the guy who was just like wanted to make everything, sound good. And, instead of going out and wanting to play shows all the time, I wanted to go make demos all the time, and then wanted to rent, and I would rent gear and, little 4-track or 8-track recorders and some mics, and we would just make demos all the time. And, that led me to, not really realizing that was like a viable career. But it led me to like wanting to experiment with sound more. So like even with guitars, like I would go and try out guitar amps, and it was, for me, that was almost more fun than like learning how to play a song. It was like just fucking with guitar pedals and amps and that kind of stuff. And one summer, I think I've told this story before, but one summer I was at a friend of mine's house, and his older brother had like just awesome, rock records and videos and, just an awesome collection of stuff from cool bands. And we were sifting through his collection of stuff, and I found this VHS video of Metallica, A Year and a Half in the Life of, which is the documentary of them making the Black Album. And the first half of it was two video cassettes, and the first half of it was them in the studio, and the second half is when they went and toured. And we watched the first half, and about 30 minutes in, like, the other 3 guys that we were hanging out with were like, fuck, this is boring. And I was just glued. I'm like, holy shit. Like, this is like Disneyland for me. Like I'm getting to watch like one of my favorite bands like make one of my favorite records. I didn't even know this thing existed, right? And I watched it, you know, from beginning to end probably like 3 times that day while my friends went out and did something else. I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm going to want to watch this again. And that was Bob Rock and Randy Staub who made that record. And I was kind of like, holy shit, like that's you know, yeah, Metallica's the band, but like those are the guys who are like doing the stuff that I like to do with my band. And I also started paying attention to album credits a little bit more, and I kept on seeing the same names on my favorite records. And then it started making me wonder. I'm like, okay, who are these guys? Like, you know, I kept on seeing Bob Rock and Bruce Fairbairn and Mutt Lange and, you know, Randy Staub and Mike Fraser and, you know, Mike Shipley. And I'm like, these guys like are the common thread on my favorite albums. So that got me very intrigued as to like, well, what does a producer and what does an engineer do? And then when I saw that Metallica movie and I was like, that's what they do. Holy shit. And I was probably 15 when I saw that. And at that point, I'm like, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Like, that's what I want to do. And so everything from there on out was like, okay, I want to make records and be in the studio for the rest of my life. So yeah, so that kind of got me into it. I went to a recording school. It was like an accelerated year program. Graduated from that scared shitless because I'm like, I don't know anything. I didn't learn anything, like feeling like I didn't learn anything. And I was able to kind of weasel my way into kind of like an informal internship at Sony Music in Toronto, and had the just amazing opportunity to work with the in-house engineers and producers there. And the head engineer, his name was Lenny DeRose, just one of my early mentors. He was friends with a guy in LA named Scott Humphrey, another Canadian who had done a bunch of records with Rob Zombie and Motley Crue, and Lenny had worked with him in the past. And one day I was at Sony cleaning up one of the rooms or getting one of the rooms ready, and Lenny came in and was like, hey, I talked to Scott. He needs an engineer in, and I was a fan of Scott's work already. So like, you know, Lenny had always kind of, you know, joked. He's like, oh, well, one day maybe you go down to LA and, you know, hang out with Scott, or if Scott's up here, we'll, you know, we'll get together or whatever. So he's like, Scott needs a guy in LA. And I think it was like probably a Tuesday or a Wednesday when this happened. And he's like, he needs you there by Friday.
Classic
and
story.
Yeah, totally. And I'm like, okay. He's like, yeah, here's his number. Call him, you know, book a flight and go. And at first I was kind of like, is this Sony business? Like, is he like, oh, Scott needs a guy. He's working on a Sony record. Like it was very kind of like, I'm like, I have no idea what this means. And then when I spoke to Scott, it was a little more like, yeah, he's got his own studio, and he's like, I've had an engineer for the last like 6-7 years, and he's going on to do another project. I need a guy to come and record a band that I'm working with. Get down here as fast as you can. And there was another time where I was like scared shitless because, you know, I had been like assistant for so long, and I was, you know, recording, you know, if artists were coming in and they wanted to do some writing or something like that, like I was running sessions, but I wasn't a quote unquote engineer. And now I'm going down to LA to work with like a really well-known like producer who I'm a fan of, making the music that I wanted to make. 'Cause that was the other thing at the time, heavy music. I mean, rock was on the charts and it was popular, but a lot of the stuff I'd done at Sony was not like heavy rock. And that's what Scott did. So I was like, holy shit, I get to do the music that I love to do. So I got on a plane. I went down there, didn't know when or if I was coming back. Everybody at Sony was like, you're not coming back. You're not coming back. I'm like, oh no, I'll see you guys in a month or two when I'm done this record. And they're like, you're not coming back. And I didn't come back. So yeah, that was 19 years ago. I think last month. Yeah. So that was 19 years ago. I worked with Scott for about 5 or 6 years and got to work with some of my favorite artists and just meet just a bunch of people and learn a lot and work on like all the gear I'd always read about and wanted to like just, be knee deep in, and great experience. And then, Scott kind of, phased out of the music business a little bit. He had some other projects going on outside of making records. And so then I kind of branched off and just kept working and tried to stay busy and keep learning and keep doing great stuff. And here we are. I've somehow managed to stick around.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, it says something about your work ethic back then that you were able to get a job with Sony to begin with, because there's not many of those opportunities available, especially these days, and to be able to stick through it, and then to all of a sudden just get this gig where, it's like, hey, fly down to LA and like you're going to stay here forever kind of thing. Like, obviously you were prepared for it. So, that says, or maybe you weren't prepared mentally for it, but obviously like your work ethic was prepared enough to keep you there, Yeah,
I mean, I think that's definitely early on. There's a saying, you don't know what you don't know. And I think there's definitely a benefit if that is the way that your brain works. My problem was I knew what I didn't know. And that was like, holy shit, I don't know. And, but I was willing to do whatever I had to do to learn. And, I was a quick learner. And I think ultimately my like panic or anxiety about not knowing what to do, I knew more than I thought I did. I knew more, and I was more experienced than I gave myself credit for. But I think that also worked well for me, because I think I see now at least a lot of young kids thinking they know everything, and that's dangerous. I think it's better to be scared and anxious that you don't know enough, and than it is to go in thinking you know everything. And I guarantee you the biggest and most successful engineers and producers in the world will admit that they don't know everything. So a kid coming out of recording school shouldn't think he knows everything. So it actually probably worked very well for me, because it also, it made me very open-minded. It made me very kind of, pliable to the situation as well, because I wasn't so locked in on, oh, this is the way I do it, or this is the thing that I do. Like when I went down to Scott's, he had a console that I'd never even seen before, and I had to learn the thing in a day. And it was like not a console that you learn in a day. It was a Euphonic CS3000, which is like the most backward. It's a great console, but it's the most backwards thing. If you learn a traditional large format console and then you sit down at a CS3000, even a veteran engineer is going to be like, how do you use this thing? And, so yeah, work ethic definitely played a lot into it. I think, I got lucky. I had a lot of opportunities just work out well. But I always tell people, getting an opportunity is one thing, and taking advantage of that opportunity and seizing the moment is something else entirely. And I was, like I said, I was lucky to get the opportunities, but I tried to make the most of them when they did arrive.
For sure. Well, what's that saying? Luck is when preparation and opportunity collide, or something like that.
Yep, absolutely.
So yeah, your work ethic was there, and your willingness to learn was also there too. So that was definitely working in your favor. Because you're right. There are so many people that come out of these recording schools and have this attitude of like, oh, I know everything. I went to school for it. And it's totally different when you're in the actual real thick of it all, I've told the story on my podcast before, but I remember like I went to an audio college as well. And I remember my first day at a studio after I graduated, like the head engineer, we're chatting, and he's like, oh, you went to an audio college? Cool. Well, forget everything you learned, because we do things differently here. Right? Right. And it was like, okay. And like that day I saw him like distorting preamps and stuff like that. And I was like, oh yeah, we were told to never do this, like, and it was just such an eye-opening experience. So for you to also go in with that same attitude of like, okay, I'm here to learn, like, let's just make this happen. Obviously you've had a successful career as a result of doing that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I still have, there's still sessions that I go into and I'm like, okay, this is going to be something completely different, or we're taking a different approach and we're going to have to learn something different, or like, I'm still as hungry to learn now as I was back then,
Mm-hmm.
I love, like podcasts like yourselves. I love listening to podcasts. I love listening to other engineers. I've been lucky to be able to meet some of the, like, my heroes that have made some of my favorite records. And I love talking to them and, picking their brain on stuff and just having conversations about this, this silly thing, making records that we all love to do. And, it's amazing because there's no one way to do anything. For sure. And, there's probably infinite ways to do the same thing. And especially now with all the tool set that we have. So hearing how different people use different things, and being able to see the benefit in different workflows and different tool sets, you really do never stop learning if you're open-minded. And that's the attitude that you have about it. And we all want to continue getting better. I don't know one guy who's like, yeah, I'm good. I don't need to get any better.
Absolutely.
Actually, I do know a few people who think that, but believe it or not, I do know a few people who probably think that, but
I would hope that at that point they've already had their legacy, and but
the people in my mind have had an amazing run. So yeah, maybe if I ever get to that point, I'll be like, no, I'm good, but I'm not there yet.
Fair enough. Well, you had mentioned that you kind of, when you really started getting into music, it was like when you started playing guitar, and that was kind of like when you started getting into like realizing like, hey, there's like rock music out there. This can be fun. And then you mentioned that you got this job at Sony where you weren't really working on rock music as much, but then this new opportunity came up, and it was like, okay, now I get my chance. So I'm curious to know, like, how do you feel your ability to play guitar has impacted the work that you do now?
Interesting. I mean, again, I'm a little naive to the benefit of it. And it's funny when people ask me, they're like, oh, do you play anything? And I'm always like, oh, I'm a hack guitar player. Like I can get by. And the reason I always say that is because I've worked with some pretty amazing guitar players. So to put myself in that realm, I'm like, I don't even come close. But if I really sit back and look at it and analyze it, it was huge. It was monumental because, for a couple different reasons. Number one, just having some musical knowledge and having, being able to, I don't want to say like, I don't have perfect pitch or anything like that, but being able to just recognize like, melodies and hear in your head harmonies and stuff like that you learn from playing guitar and learn from maybe figuring out some of your favorite songs is great. But I think for me as an engineer, the thing that was very beneficial, was like I said, I liked playing with tone. So, I would get EQ pedals and I would tweak them. And so like, I didn't realize, but when I was like 15, I was basically like doing ear training because I was taking a Boss graphic EQ pedal through a distorted Marshall, and I would, turn up a frequency and hear how it would affect the amp. And then I was like, okay, well, what, I later on would hear about like how, some of, like Dimebag would put an EQ, a parametric EQ in the loop. So I go to rent a parametric EQ and be like, for a weekend, and be like, well, what does this do if I put it through, the effects loop of my guitar amp? And then it'd be like, oh shit, that does something completely different. But then you start sweeping, and I was doing ear training without knowing it. So then when it came time to where I was like engineering and tracking and eventually mixing, like I'm already kind of familiar with frequencies and how they work together with other things. So from an engineering standpoint, I think that was very beneficial. From a production standpoint, just, knowing how to play an instrument and knowing how to play, music from a sense of like, okay, how does this work together? Or, how chords can work together harmonically, or how rhythms can affect certain things. Like that was the other thing, is like the music I liked to play. I was never a lead guitar player. I never spent time learning solos. I wish I did, but I didn't. Like but I would sit there just practicing, palm muting and picking very evenly and playing chords clean and muting strings with my left hand between notes and like trying to make it sound like James Hetfield who's an awesome rhythm player, or Malcolm Young. Like I always unplugged the one speaker that was Angus, and I would like learn Malcolm Young's parts because I just thought, I'm like, man, they're so cool, and his tone was so good. And those were the parts that I learned. That's what I gravitated towards. So it was more about kind of the foundation and less about the lead stuff, which I think helps from a production level. Because I think a lot of the production stuff is just figuring out how the foundation can support everything else.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a couple interesting things to take out of that. Like the idea of you learning like the ear training side of it with EQ on your guitar. It's like that's definitely a thing I think a lot of people don't even put together, that when it comes to like mixing, they're very similar. It's like you're shaping the sound on your amp to fit the sound of your song. So it's like, mixing is basically doing that with multiple instruments, right? So, to think of it that way is definitely kind of a different twist on it. And also, from the playing side of it too, I like what you said about kind of just like figuring out the foundation of the songs, and that's really what it is. It's like you learned kind of by listening to things in context and figuring out how to piece things together, your tone wise or performance parts wise. And I think that's such an important thing, because I find a lot of people tend to just focus on their own instrument and not really see the rest of it as like one cohesive unit. So,
I've done plenty of that too.
Well, I guess every tone junkie does that at some point,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. But no, you're right. You're right, because I would be at home tweaking stuff with my guitar, and I'd get, this awesome sound. And then, I'd go to band practice, and we'd have the drums and bass and, vocals or whatever. And all of a sudden I'm like, man, I can't hear what I'm playing anymore. And realized like I was chasing Injustice for All tones, and I scooped out too much mid-range. And now like I can't even hear, like nobody can hear the riff I'm playing. So realizing, okay, I got to put some mid-range back into it, or I got to change the mid-range cut that I'm doing. If I still want a scooped sound, I got to move that to a different spot. Sounds fucking killer when I'm by myself and nothing else is happening. But soon as I go, to play with the band, I've got to change that. So yeah, it was, by all means, I'm like, I was completely unaware of any of this at the time. Like I didn't know what I was doing. I was just playing around. Like I had no idea. It was only later that like having conversations like this that I look back and be like, oh shit. Yeah. Like I was doing that when I was playing around with guitar tones. And kind of putting two and two together, like, 15 years later. Like none of this was on purpose. This was all just, playing around.
For sure. Well, hey, I mean, it shows that you had that experience, because when I listen to your mixes, they sound massive, and especially your guitar tones. Like that's just one of the qualities of your tracks that I just really admire. Like you've always had this knack for getting amazing tones, and one thing that like really stands out to me with your mixes is stereo width. Like I don't know how you do it, but you make your tracks sound gigantic. And
just never listen in mono ever.
fair. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, like, I mean, your tracks, like, you just have this amazing ability to get your song sounding like so massive, so wide. And I was wondering if you had any tips for getting that massive wide sound. Like, is it just all panning, or is it EQ? Do you use stereo widening tools? Like, what's your process for that kind of thing?
It's all of the above. For me, mixing, and I don't mean this as a compliment to myself, but like I look at mixing like the way like Jerry Bruckheimer makes movies. Like I don't want, if the car blows up, I don't want it to look like what a car probably looks like when it blows up. I want it to look like 50 times what it actually would be. So I like cartoon mixes is kind of like how I describe it. I want CGI. I want I want it to be the comic book version, or the CGI version of real life. And so, yeah, you know what? I'm not afraid to stick wideners in several different spots in the mix. And like I said, don't listen in mono, because, once you start using too much of that, I've definitely gotten calls after doing mixes that everybody's like, holy shit, this sounds great. And I'll get a call like right before mastering being like, hey, I was playing this for my buddy and we were playing it on like a Bluetooth speaker. And I'm like, most of those are mono. Even if they have two little woofers on the end, most of those are mono. And And they're like, yeah, I couldn't hear the guitars. And I'm like, yeah, oops. They're like, just don't listen on that. And they're like, but, and I'm like, well, we can make the stereo version a little less cartoony and you can get your mono back, or we can leave it where it is. And you know, and there's tricks around helping that. I mean, I don't just completely sacrifice the mono, but, so to answer your question, panning is obviously one thing. And, you know, one of the tricks I will say, and it's different for every song. So, you know, kind of, you're going to have to play around with this, is dynamics are important across a mix. And I'm not talking about volume. Like I'm talking, when I say dynamics, I'm talking about like loud versus quiet, bright versus dark, close versus far, wide versus narrow. Like having those elements in a mix being dynamic is very beneficial. For instance, things can only seem wide if there's something next to it that doesn't seem wide. You know what I mean? If everything's wide, you're not going to get the sense of wide because it's just, you get used to it. Your brain gets used to it. So, you know, from a production standpoint, or even if I'm not producing, if I'm mixing, like sometimes what I'll do is I will narrow the panning until the section that I want, or until the thing I want to sound really wide. So, you know, if I've got a pair of rhythm guitars and then a triple and a quad come up, and I want that triple and quad to be panned out further, I'll just make sure before those come in that the first and the second rhythm guitars are in a little bit. So while you're listening, you're like, everything's hard left and hard right, but it's actually not. But your brain thinks it is, and that's your baseline.
So you might have those at like half panned kind of thing.
Yeah, probably a little more than that. But let's say like, you know, 75 each way, just for like a Pro Tools number. You know, and again, it's all relative, right? 75, you know, yes, that gets you a spot, but depending on what else you have going on, 75 might not be wide. You know, if you've got the drums panned hard left and hard right, and you've got some real like active room mics panned hard left and hard right, those 75 guitars might seem narrow. So again, that's kind of everything's you got to have perspective, and it's all in context. But you know, it's one of the tricks is, yeah, you know, if you want something to pop out wide, you have to have other stuff in a little bit, so that way when that thing comes in, it's like it pulls your ear out further. So that's one trick. Wideners are great. And like I said, you can get into trouble with wideners really easily. So you got to, number one, spend some time finding the one that seems to fuck with everything else the least. One of the ones that I love is the Izotope Ozone imager. That's one that I really like. SPL, both the hardware and the soft and the plug-in versions of the SPL stuff has some cool wideners as well. And I use them on different things. Like I might use them on the whole mix, but I also might just use them on a pair of rhythm guitars, or I might just use them on a keyboard. Again, it's like if you bring everything out and everything is fake wide, like there's no point in doing it. Your brain gets so used to that, and it's static. It's not dynamic. Your brain gets used to that. You'd be better off taking it off and just leaving everything panned hard left and hard right. And that being as wide as it gets. And then the other thing that I find, I'd say this is more common with, I don't want to say beginners, but people maybe who aren't as experienced, is, you know, your ear is going to interpret because of differences in the audio. So, you know, if everything is the exact same in the left and the right, it's going to be less apparent how wide they are. And so, you know, you can deal with that a couple different ways. Like let's say with doing guitars, if you're doing a pair of rhythm guitars, if you've got a really great guitar player who can play really tight, and you use the same guitar and the same amp and the same everything, and you do a track on the left and a track on the right and pan it wide, it's gonna sound really good. But it's not going to sound as wide as if there's maybe something that's just a little different. So whether it be like, going to a different guitar, going to a different amp, maybe you got the same amp, same guitar, but you change the balance of the mics if you've got multiple mics on it, or if you're using like a guitar amp simulator, changing the IR, just changing something a little bit can draw it out that much more. And the other thing that I like to do with a really good guitar player that can help that as well is doing a triple and a quad. Because you're just adding another element of differentiating material to the left and the right. So if you have a sloppy guitar player, adding a triple and a quad is worse. But if you have a good guitar player, it can actually enhance the width.
Love that. Yeah. So when you do triples and quads, because this is obviously a debate that I feel like a lot of engineers talk about, like, how many guitar tracks is too much, and where does that mud come in, right? And to your point, like if you're a sloppy guitar player, then it's going to get sloppy very quick, no matter what. But when you're adding your triples and quads, are you typically just using those to accent spots? Like you talked about kind of having like maybe a chorus get a little bit wider and kind of going 100% left and right. Is that when the triples and quads would come in, or are you talking about having those like throughout all of your rhythm tracks?
That's when the 5 and the 6 and the 7 and 8 come in.
Okay.
No, I mean, again, so context related, right? There are songs where from top to bottom, the rhythm guitar is 4 tracks. And then there might be accents that come in, whether it be a part accent, or if it's the same part, might be a different sound, something to accent or to give it a lift, or just to give it a little bit of a scene change or a texture change. That might be another pair, a 5 or 6, maybe those are panned in a little bit. Maybe they're up the middle. Like, it's so context related. Like, I mean, even with some of the bands that I work with who are known for having just like really, really big, massive guitar tracks, there's no hard and steady rule. Sometimes it's 2 left and right. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 3. Sometimes it's left and right with 1 up the middle. There's no hard and steady rule. It's either riff dependent. Like, how does this play with the riff? It's production related, like how does this play with the rest of the production. Sometimes the other thing that I find is, depending on how a song starts production wise, like if it starts with a guitar riff and let's say we're working on program drums or a click track, and you're like, okay, cool, we did a left and a right and it sounds great and it sounds awesome, and then you start building up the track and you're like, man, the guitars they sounded really big at first, but now we got everything else sounding really big too. I think we just need another layer. So we'll just do another layer and add them on top. Sometimes you get to the end and you try that 3rd and 4th layer and you're like, oh, it made it worse. It's just trial and error. And it's also just, very context dependent. But I guess the tip within that whole thing that I just said was, don't have any like hard and steady rules. There shouldn't be a debate whether one's better than the other, because one might be better on one song and one might be better on the other. Like there is no right answer. So just do whatever works for whatever you're working on right at that point in time. And here's the other thing. There are parts where you're like, we don't need a double. We don't need to double that. It's funny how, and like I said, I love fucking Jerry Bruckheimer productions, right? I'm always the guy who's like, I'd rather have 10 guitars and then mute 6 of them than not have enough. And it became such a status quo of like, you'd play a guitar part, and before you were even done the guitar part, like the engineer was already like hitting the double, getting another track ready to go. And you're like, but we haven't even really heard how that worked. Like maybe that works perfectly. Maybe we don't need a double. Like it just became such common practice to just, you have to double that. Do we need to double that? Well, that's just what we do. And you're like, okay, but like there are parts that you're like, no, that sounds great as is, or that tone works better on its own. And the great thing is now it's so easy to try stuff and be able to be like, no, that didn't work. Try it.
I love that, man. I think that you just brought up such a good point there, because we kind of a lot of people tend to do things instinctively, and it's just like, oh, I've just always done it this way, so I just continue to do it.
And I'm guilty of that too. I mean, I get into that. Everybody does.
Yeah. And I love that, you kind of basically just said like, this whole conversation is like, how do you make your guitar track sound wide? And it kind of started at first like, we have multiple layers of guitars and there might be like 5 or 6 guitars, but then you also said, but it could sound good with 2. And that could give you like the maximum width. And then you said, we can do it with 1. So it's like,
Yeah, I mean, one's not going to give you a lot of width. But,
no, one won't give you the width, but if it's a good tone, then it's a good tone.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I mean, you think of some of my, favorite records, not necessarily from a production standpoint, but just like, growing up, I mentioned AC/DC, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, like those are some of my favorite bands. And those are bands that historically don't have doubles left and right. Like there's either one guitar player playing one thing in one side and another guitar player playing another thing in another side. Or in the case of Van Halen, sometimes it's just one thing in one side and like the reverb on the other side. And those are all great sounding records that have a vibe and those, you don't listen to those records and be like, ooh, this sounds mono. It's a different thing. But there have been plenty of, I would probably argue most of the, let's say, most iconic rock records of all time don't have, the, pair of rhythms tracked perfectly left and right with the quad and a triple. And like most of them don't have that. And we don't listen to any of those records and be like, nobody listens to Back in Black and we're like, yeah, this doesn't sound good because we didn't double all of the guitar parts. Like nobody's ever said that.
Yeah. Well, I think that in those cases, it really comes down to just the arrangement overall, right? It's like at the end of the day, you just don't want your mixes to sound lopsided. So if you have only one part going on in one speaker, but then there's nothing on the other, well, then your ear is going to just gravitate to that one side. So it's about kind of finding that balance of the parts so that even if you do have a single take of your, like 2 guitars on panned hard left and right, as long as they're kind of complementing each other, then you're going to feel that width.
100%. And that goes back to when there's differences, sometimes that stuff can feel wider. So that's another trick that, not trick, but that's like another thing, that we've also gotten into in modern music production is, there's a lot of scenarios where if you're in let's say a 5-piece band, the producer will have the best guitar player play everything, including the bass sometimes, because they want the bass just to lock in with the guitars, right? And just low octave of it. And when you do that, it's got a very cool sound because everything's so locked. But again, going back to some of the most iconic records of all time, you've got different people playing on different sides of the stereo field. So it's like, even if they're playing the same part, they're going to play it different enough to where you're going to get some of that width just because there's differences happening in each speaker. So, and to completely contradict myself, like, on the other hand, some of my favorite albums, the Black Album or, Dr. Feelgood or whatever, like those would sound funny if they didn't have those like super tight, wide left and right guitar things going on, right? Like some of my favorite sounding records would sound odd if they didn't have that. So again, it's so context, dependent that, you really can't have a hard and steady rule on that. And if you do, you're leaving a lot on the table. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, our job is to make these songs sound incredible and to serve the song at all times. So, constantly reevaluating how the mix is shaping up, even in the recording stage, like it's all about that end result. So, making sure everything works together. Love that. When it comes to adding that many, like you talked about having like sometimes 5 or 6 guitars, what's your approach to getting those stacks? Like, are you trying to, I know some people will try to have like a clean guitar stacked with like a dirtier guitar, like a super dirty guitar, and like they'll kind of stack up these 3 different parts and blend those together. Do you kind of tend to take that approach more, or are you using kind of more of the same or similar tones? Like maybe all 6 guitars are distorted. Like what's your approach to making those massive walls of guitar?
Yeah, I would say I kind of dig in on that a little bit more. It's less about kind of dirty, clean, heavy versus not, more about what frequencies there are. And that's, again, kind of going back to when I would fuck with guitar tones. I remember very distinctively, just kind of circling back a little bit, I remember very distinctively, I bought... This has become like a hot button conversation. I bought a Boss Metal Zone guitar pedal, and it had a parametric EQ on it, on the mid range. The mid range had like a sweepable frequency and boost. It wasn't fully parametric, and I remember playing with it, and I remember getting a tone that I really liked, where I was boosting mid range. And then I got a really good tone that I liked where I was cutting mid-range, but a different frequency. So it was either like boosting one frequency or cutting a different frequency. And I would always flip-flop, like for the entire time that I used this pedal as like my distortion sound. Like one day I'd be like, oh man, this sounds really good. And then the next day I'd be like, oh man, one day, oh, this sounds really good, whatever. And that's kind of the way that I treat layering guitars, is like, if I'm going to do a triple and a quad, I try to get, I don't want to say the opposite sound, but I'll try to get a sound that complements the other one. So if it's already a scooped, kind of big, distorted scooped sound, well, then I'll get something that's maybe got a little more mid-range definition for the stack. If the main sound is something that's already got mid-range, well, then maybe what I'll do is I'll use the other one to create some size and just some thickness, and I'll scoop it out. And so it's about finding stuff that complements. Sometimes the way to do that, again, the scapegoat on this whole thing is called context, right? Sometimes the way to do that is to make it cleaner. And that's the other thing. Have intent, have a purpose. So if I'm going to do a triple and a quad, it's not going to be for no reason. There's a reason I'm doing it. So what is the reason? Is the reason because the single and the double doesn't have enough, excitement? Is it too tight to where I'm not getting the width? I want some more stuff kind of, making it different to give it a little bit more, discrepancy between the left and the right. It's a great tone, but it's lacking a little definition. Like, again, if you're going to do it, know why you're doing it. And that should direct you to what to do next. So if you're like, hey, this is great, I love this rhythm guitar sound we got, but I'm losing some of the articulation once the drums kind of get loud as well, or once the vocal comes in, we're starting to lose some articulation. Okay, well, you need something that's a little, you're going to need an additional sound that's maybe a little more defined. Maybe it's got a little more mid-range, but the mid-range is in a different frequency than the vocal or the snare drum. And that's going to tell you what you need to do. You're going to be like, okay, let's do a triple and a quad. Let's back down the gain. Let's make it, instead of it being scooped, let's make it, a little more defined with some more mid-range. Let's use a guitar that's maybe not as hot, or a guitar that's maybe a little, doesn't have as much bottom end. So that way it's just a cleaner sound from the bottom end standpoint, or that too, roll off all the bottom end. Like, just taking a sound and rolling off all the bottom end can make a huge difference in terms of clarity and articulation. So sometimes it's the same setup and we're just like, okay, let's roll off all the bottom end, either by using a guitar that has a pickup with less bottom end, or graphic EQ, or doing it on the mic preamp. Like, there's so many different ways you can do it, or in a plugin after the fact. So knowing why you're doing it will kind of point you into the direction of what to do next. If that makes any sense.
Man, I love that answer. It's great because it does really put into context like how to decide what kind of setup you're going to go with. I'm curious to know though, like, because I guess a lot of people would listen to this and think, well, why not just use EQ after the fact? So like, how do you go about making those decisions of like, oh, I can just EQ this later versus like, no, I need a different tone altogether to complement this existing track?
It's hard to explain. It's easier to show somebody and have with examples. But I find, especially with distorted guitars, you get a harmonic buildup. And people talk about like low end building up. Like, you're like, if everything you have just has lots of low end, the low end just starts building up and is very undefined. I get the same thing. Like, my ears hear the same thing with distortion. And, the sound of a distorted guitar is a lot of harmonic overtones. And when it's the same amp and the same guitar and the same everything, same cabinet, same mic, same EQ, same everything, all of those harmonic overtones just start building up on top of each other. And sometimes just changing one thing, aside from EQ at the end, sometimes changing one thing kind of ahead of time, guitar, pickup, head, channel on the head, cabinet, mic on the cabinet, depending on how hard you're driving a mic preamp. Sometimes changing a mic preamp can even do it too. I mean, if you're not driving the mic preamp much, switching out mic preamps is probably not going to make a huge difference for you. But for me, I don't mind trying it. Like if we're like, hey, we need a triple and a quad, and I'm kind of like, yeah, you know what? I think we need the same sound. Like I like the way that this is sounding. I want it to be a little wider, and there's nothing else is bothering me about it. We just want it wider and bigger. Leave the same sound. And then in mixing, most of the time I'll end up EQing it just a little bit different, so that way you're not getting as much buildup. But you'll hear pretty quickly if you're like, yeah, it's not solving my problem. And you might EQ it a little bit and you're like, it's still not solving my problem. Or you're hearing the things that are bugging you build up. And you're like, I'm getting more shh and not the definition, or I'm getting more and not the definition. And you might try to EQ it and it doesn't work. That's when you might go to something else. And I think ultimately that's one of those things where the more you do it, the more experienced you get. And there are certain sounds and certain parts that I know right out of the gate, I got to go to a different amp. I got to go to a different guitar. I'm not going to be able to fix this with EQ. And it's usually the more harmonically complex the part is, or the sound is, the more I need to change more stuff. So I'll give you an example. If I'm doing a song and it's I'm trying to think of a song, like something with a single note guitar riff, something with a single note that's maybe not super fast, whatever, and you're just playing whatever the first thing comes in my head. That I could probably layer up with the same sound 6 times, and it would just keep getting better and better and better until it doesn't. And then you're like, cool, that sounds great. We don't need to change a bunch of stuff. If you're playing like chords with thirds and everything's ringing out and there's just so much harmonic content being generated, or even if it's, a couple big chords with a riff in between and then a couple big chords with a riff in between, just using the same thing and just layering that on top and on top and on top, that's going to be counterproductive real fast. So it's a little bit of trial and error and figuring out like what's going to work and what's not going to work, and having a little bit of foresight for that. And that comes with experience. Just being like, hey, the last 8 times I tried to do that, it didn't work. I don't need to try it a 9th time. It's not going to work. Let's just go to something else. Let's head that problem off. And hopefully it doesn't take you 8 times to figure it out. It might only take you like 4 or 5, but Yeah,
man, I love that answer. Like that was such a clear answer that I think anyone who's listening to this, it'll just click. It makes a lot of sense. I do want to go back a sec, because earlier you were talking about using these stereo widening tools, and you kind of mentioned like, don't listen to it in mono. And that's something that I get asked a lot. Like people are saying like, don't we need mono? Shouldn't we be like making our mixes sound really good in mono? And like, when my mixes are panned hard left and right and I hit that mono button, everything disappears. What's your take on that? Like what's the approach to take there?
Ignorance. I don't know. It's I don't want to be so like, brash and be like, I kind of don't care, because I do care. I do care how it sounds. I do know there's literally an infinite amount of listening environments out there. Literally, if you've got a stereo system, with the same set of speakers that don't move, that stereo system's going to sound infinitely different depending on like where you are in that room. So it's like I guess my philosophy is I kind of don't want, and this opens up a big can of worms. I kind of don't want to accommodate the lowest like common denominator, if that makes any sense. I don't want to aim for that. And I know mixers and I know producers who do. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that at all. I sleep better at night knowing that my mix sounded as good as it can coming out of the speakers that I mixed it on. And obviously I take into account how that's going to translate. That's a huge part of what I do. But I also try to get my monitoring system set up so that way that's not like an afterthought. It's happening at the same time. I can't control if somebody, if one of their speakers on their home stereo is broken, or if they're listening in the other room with the door half closed and, it doesn't sound that good. Well, yeah, you were in your closet getting dressed and your stereo's in your living room. It's like, well, I can't control that. And I know that's a far fetch from somebody listening on like a Beats, or a pill or something. Yeah. But I don't prioritize it. I'm aware of it and I don't prioritize it unless a client calls me and is like, yeah, you know what? I don't want that. I think ultimately most people would, at least in my experience, most of my clients want it to sound as good as it can sound in kind of under regular circumstances. Then, well, let's sacrifice that a little bit to make it sound a little better on, a little shitty mono Bluetooth speaker. So yeah, it's one of those things. I'm really interested to see. I mean, I've been playing around with Atmos, for a little bit, and I'm interested to see, one of my big questions on that is like, well, how does this translate? Like, how is this going to translate to other non 15 plus speaker setups? Like, how is this going to work? And I mean, I love mixing in Atmos, but it's like, that's another can of worms where I'm like, okay, so when we're mixing in Atmos, are we going to start making decisions based off the guy who's got a sound bar? I'm like at some point you got to kind of just to make your priority, whatever you're going to make it. And so, yeah, I don't give it a ton of credence, just because it's like not what doesn't kind of fall in line with what I'm trying to do.
It's true. There's so many different mediums that people could be listening on. So, to try to please everyone is a very difficult and challenging task. And yeah, ultimately, you're right. The regular listening environment is going to be a stereo setup. So might as well shoot for that. Because who knows? Maybe even Atmos won't survive,
who knows? I'm very interested. But I mean, these days, pretty much everybody I know has got a set of earbuds. And again, talking about lowest common denominator. Yeah, I do check Apple earbuds to make sure mixes translate well with those. Everybody's got a pair of that, or a pair of some sort of headphones. Everybody's got, even the most of the smartphones now do have stereo speakers. I'm not just talking about two speakers, but talking about a discrete left and right channel, because most of those Bluetooth speakers don't have a left and a right channel. It's mono. Most people have cars that they're listening to. Most people have a TV with two. The mono scenario to me is just so minor and minute. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, the type of music that I make, as much as the guitars are exciting and as much as, everything is, production wise is a big chunk of it, the vocal's still coming across, the song's still coming across. There's always something that's getting, the root note out the center speaker. There's always, the vocal's always going to be coming out the center. So at the end of the day, if somebody's listening on one of those and they're like, yeah, the guitars don't sound, the guitars kind of disappear. And I'm like, yeah, you know what song it is, right? You still like the song and you're still hearing all the notes, maybe not the guitars as clear as you want, or maybe that riff's not speaking the way it is. You're still hearing the kick drum and the snare drum for the beat. You're still hearing the vocal for the melody. You're still hearing the root note of the bass and maybe a center guitar or whatever else. Like, it's not like the speaker no longer works.
Yeah. And at
just
the end of the
missing
day, people are
something.
singing the lyrics. They're not singing the guitar parts or that kind of thing, right?
Well, sometimes they're singing the guitar parts,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's again, it's one of those scenarios where I can't. At some point, I draw the line, and maybe my line's a little further down the line than most people's, but so.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is that another aspect of your mixes that I've always really loved is the sound of your snare tones, and especially on like the heavier Nickelback stuff. Like that snare just sounds massive. Like I don't know how to describe. I don't know how to describe it other than that. Like you just have this way of getting these like gigantic sounds that are fat but not flubby sounding or like super bloated. Like, and I'm curious to pick your brain about what's your secret for getting a massive snare tone.
Samples.
Okay.
That's not such a secret, but I've never had a problem. Like I've never had a problem philosophically using samples. I'm not like going back to the Jerry Bruckheimer analogy. Like I'm not precious being like, oh well, it doesn't sound real, and I'm like, I don't care. Like, does it sound good? Does it sound exciting? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Yes, fine. I don't care how we got it. I don't care if it sounds real or not. Like, it just, again, in context, if you're doing a soft ballad with brush that's got like or a blast sticks part or whatever, you don't want to use a big shotgun sounding sample. Yeah, exactly. But for the most part, in the heavy stuff, context. It's so secrets to getting a big snare drum. Well, let's dig into the sample thing, because when people hear me say samples, they're like, oh, we'll just start piling on samples. You got to be able to, like, why are you using a sample in the first place? Okay, well, if the snare drum sounded the way that I wanted it to sound, I wouldn't have to use a sample. There's inherent problems with getting a live snare drum to sound the way that I want it in the context of some of those big heavy mixes, whether that be leakage, whether that be microphone placement, because the drummer doesn't have enough room for you to get a microphone. Like where we put a microphone on a snare drum is actually not that great of a spot. Like if we were, I've done sample libraries. And if you just have a snare drum in the middle of the room and you can put a mic anywhere on it, it's not going to end up being where it is on 95% of the drum recordings, because you're going to have it in a different spot. Like snare drums sound great with mics, not like just right up on the head at some weird angles, jammed between a hi-hat and a tom and a splash cymbal and a crash right at, like, that's not the at least for me, that's not the optimal placement. But that's what you have to deal with. You've got hi-hats going on. You've got bleed going on. You've got all this stuff happening, right? You've got the dynamics of a drummer. A lot of drummers, some of the best drummers, the reason why they're good isn't because they can play complicated parts. It's because every time they hit the drum, it sounds the same. That's what makes them a better drummer than the guy next door, is they can control the sound of their drums. So it's like, I've worked with some amazing drummers, and people are like, oh, could they play anything? And I'm like, no, they could play like boots and cats. And it sounded fucking perfect. Every hit just sounded the same, and it sounded great, and everything was singing. That's, to me, what makes a great drummer. At least part of what makes a great drummer, more so than how complicated of a part they can play. And so if somebody sends me a track, or if I'm recording drums, yeah, I'm going to try to get the live snare drum sounding as good as it can, and sounding the way that I hear it in my head. And what I hear in my head is usually, within context of the production. So when I, like, if I'm producing a track and we got a guitar riff going, and, we're tracking drums on a, kind of bed tracks, I have a sound in my head that I want to hear. And I don't know if that's just, my taste, or if it's instinct, or if it's because I'm inspired by stuff that I've heard before. Whatever it is, a sound pops into my head. And so then it's about making that happen. And if it means that the snare drum's got a ton of low end and a ton of high end, and I can't get that from the live snare for various reasons, then I'll just go to a sample. But I'm not picking samples. Again, talking about intent. I listen to the snare drum and I say, well, what do I need? Okay, well, I need more top end. Well, if I turn the EQ on the top end of the live snare, I start hearing the hi-hats too much, or it's not giving me the right top end. It's like the snare doesn't have the top end that we need. Okay, so I'll turn up the bottom mic. Maybe that will give me more of the rattle. Okay, cool. But now I'm getting too much rattle and not enough just air. It's like the samples are solving problems. Just in my experience, they solve the problems way better than any tool that I can put on a live snare drum. So I go to it very fast. I go to it very quickly. Like, even when I'm comping drums, like I'll be comping the second we're done a drum take, I'll be triggering samples while I'm comping. Why not? Like, why not make it sound that right away? From the minute the drummer comes back in the room, he's depending on what we're doing, he might be hearing samples right away. And just to make it sound closer to what we want it to be. And we'll get it as far as we can with the live mics. But the samples are there to solve problems. So kind of going back to that, if you want a specific kind of crack that you're just not getting, maybe the drummer can't play it. Maybe he doesn't hit the drum hard enough. Maybe he doesn't hit it the right way. Well, you know what? I've got a sample that does exactly what I want it to do. And I've got billions of samples. I've got too many samples. I don't even know where to find them anymore. But I have my favorites. And the other thing is when you're working with samples, a mistake that I see a lot of people make is they just they're like, oh, I like that one. I like that one. I like that one. I like that one. Let's have them all firing together at the same time. Going back to the guitar tone, conversation. Figure out what your problem is and pick the solution that's going to fix the problem. Don't just keep on layering like, oh, we don't have enough definition. Well, I'm going to use the same sound that doesn't have enough definition. Well, that's not going to solve the problem. Like, get something that's got more definition that will help solve the problem. So again, I do the same thing with samples. I usually have a sample that takes care of, like, let's say a snare drum. I've got a sample ultimately that's got like the tone. I've got a sample that's got the crack. I've got a sample that's got like the air. I've got a sample that's got low end, like punchy low end. I've got like the ooh sample. Like, it's almost like you hear it and you're like, is that a tom mixed with a white noise? They're not all doing the same thing. And then you can blend them to figure out, like, to get the sound that's in your head. Be like, oh, okay, I've got the okay, but now it sounds like a Simmons drum machine. I need some more crack to make it sound like a real snare drum. Maybe you mix a real snare drum in. You're like, that solved it. Now I need some more air. So then you turn up the one that's got the air. It's, again, talking about width, using room samples. Sometimes, believe it or not, there was a project I did a couple of years ago where while we were tracking it, I was like, really, like, the drummer was great. He had great equipment. We had a drum tech that was just tuning everything great. I'm like, fuck, this snare drum is sounding awesome. Like, this might be the first time in my life I'm not going to use a sample. And it became a little bit of a joke, being like, oh, Baseford said he's not going to use the sample. Oh, let's see if he can do it, whatever. And it became kind of a little bit of a joke. And by the end of it, the only thing that we did use the sample, but we just used a room sample, because in context of the kit, the real snare drum was giving us everything we needed, except for the big wide room thing. And so I just use a room sample.
Man, I love that answer. You're so articulate with your thought process. I love it.
It's all about, if there's kind of like an underlying lesson that I try to kind of give to people who are learning how to do this or doing it on their own, is there's a lot of power in having intent. I find a lot of what we do, especially with so much at our fingertips, it's very easy to get just lost in the weeds of, like, I've got 50 billion plugins, I've got 1,000 and 10,000 snare drum samples, and I've got 50 guitar amp simulators that are the best amps in the world, like that. Everybody has everything, so it's very easy to get lost. Like, let your intent drive the decision making. So don't just like be like, oh, I want to use this guitar amp. Okay, well, like ask yourself before you pick a guitar amp, like, what's the problem, or why are you doing something, or why are you going towards this amp, or what's the problem that you need to solve, and let that point you in the direction of the solution. And it's like that with just about everything, like especially when it comes to sound, because sound, like mixing and recording, it's a bunch of problem solving. It's making, how do you fit 100 pounds of shit into a 10-pound bag? And like, that's a lot of problem solving. That's a lot of Tetris and trying to piece it all together. So let the problem or what you're trying to do give you some intent to fix it with all the tools that you have at your fingertips. Don't just be like, oh, I like that one, or that's my favorite, or that's that, or so-and-so used that, or, so-and-so on, this podcast told me to do that, it gives, it's good to give you hints, and it's good to give you insight, but know why you're doing it. And that will help solve the problem a lot better.
Absolutely.
So, if you don't need 10 samples, don't use 10 samples. If you have that one sample that solves all your problems, you're done. And if your snare drum doesn't have any problems, if you're like, fuck, that sounds good, I'm getting everything I need, then you don't need a sample.
Love it, man. I could talk your ear off about this stuff for hours, because like I just love the way you think and just how detailed you are with your answers. It's amazing. Unfortunately, I do have another podcast interview that I got to do shortly, but I have to ask you. I know that you recently just put out a brand new plugin, and I have to ask about this. Obviously, you put out a plugin with ML Sound Labs called the CB4, and it's a guitar sim. Can you tell us a little bit about it and why you decided to make a plugin? Yep,
absolutely. So, I've came across ML Sound Lab a couple of years ago. So I've been using guitar amp simulators for years, like since I was tweaking with tone when I was a teenager, and some of the really kind of beginning stages of guitar amp simulators were in a hardware form were out. So I've been a big proponent of that. I do like live guitar, real guitar amps as well, but it's just all tools to me. And if it, again, what works for whatever you're going to do. But anyways, one of my favorite guitar amps, like kind of my desert island guitar amp, is an amp called a Diesel VH4. And I've probably used that amp more on just about any other amp that I've used in the studio, and it's got 4 great channels that you can use for a bunch of different stuff, and it's a big, expensive, heavy guitar amp that not everybody has one. I've gone to sessions where we don't have access to one. I don't want to lug mine with me. There's just a variety of things, and there were already some amp sims of it out there, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do. And I've got just about every amp sim there is available, but for whatever reason, like when I want that sound, I didn't really have it. I was always having to use a different simulation that was a little bit different, or a different amp model within a different box and whatever. So when I started using the ML Sound Lab stuff, they were making IRs, guitar amps IRs, and I'd reached out to them. Miko's the guy over there, and said, "Hey, you know what? Would you be interested in doing some IR libraries together?" And he just started doing amp sims, and he's like, you know what? He's like, yeah, absolutely. But he's like, have you tried some of my amp sims? He goes like, I would love to talk to you a little bit about that. And so we started kind of coming up with some ideas, and he was like, what don't you have that, like, what do you feel is missing? And I said, well, believe it or not, like my favorite guitar amp, like my Desert Island, like studio amp, there's a bunch of sims out there, but none of them do what I wanted. None of it sounds like my amp or the other 3 diesels that I use often that at other studios. Like it doesn't sound the same. So we decided to do that. And I mean, he probably got really annoyed with me, but we didn't stop until that thing sounded indistinguishable from my own VH4. And part of why I wanted to do it selfishly was so that I always had that. And I didn't have to, I didn't have to have a wall of amps. I didn't have to have a studio to mic up the cab. I didn't have to have mics and I didn't have, like, I could literally, I'm like, I could take this with me anywhere. I can have it on any rig. Every one of my clients can have it on their system. So I don't need to bring anything. I don't need like nothing. It's like, we've got that sound at all times. And, the added benefit was being able to give other people access to such an amazing sounding guitar amp simulator at a pretty like reasonable price, considering the amp's like $4,000, and that's just the amp head. You still have to have a cabinet, you still have to have a room to mic it, you have to if you were to build the chain the way that I'm used to using, it's probably like $7,000, $8,000 or $9,000, and having the space and the soundproof isolation to do it, and for less than $100, you can basically have that on your computer. It was pretty cool to me. So, it was a company that was willing to do a no compromise. This thing doesn't come out until you are absolutely happy, and we're going to make it sound exactly the way that you are used to hearing that sound. And we've had a lot of great feedback, and I've been using it on sessions ever since it came out, and everybody's blown away. So, yeah, we've got more. We've got a couple other amps that we're working on as well. So there'll be more coming down the pipeline soon. But yeah, it was an awesome project, and I'm just so happy to actually like have that with me, on my laptop at every studio, and other people can enjoy it as well. So
that's amazing. Yeah, I was messing around with it earlier this week, and it's incredible, man. It's such a good amp sim, and like what I love about it is that it has such a diverse range of sound out of it. It has everything from the cleanest of cleans to like the dirtiest of dirt, and everything in between. So it's I can see why it would be your desert island amp, because it covers all the bases.
Yeah, that amp is kind of known for the third channel, like channel 3. There was a certain time, there's probably like a 10-year period of rock music where like you turn on the radio, you turn on K-Rock, and it's like, that's Diesel channel 3. Like it's what like a certain group of guys producers were just using, and it was like, that's the thing. And that's what it's known for. And one of the things, it's interesting, like one of the challenges for me once it was done and getting it out was for people, I'm like, we know channel 3 is good. Just don't use channel 3 for a while. Like play with the other stuff. Cause I think people just are like, oh, that's VH4 channel 3. Just go to channel 3. I use channel 2 all the time. Channel 4 is awesome too. And channel 1's the clean channel. It literally is each one of those channels. You could make an amp and sell that amp with just that one channel, and there would be a lot of people that would be like, oh man, like if channel 2 on the Diesel was its own amp under a different name, under a different thing, people would be like, oh dude, that's the best amp for like, just edge of breakup, clean, but slightly distorted. And then you can kind of go into like, people would go ape shit over channel 2 if it wasn't dwarfed by channel 3. So, I've been trying to like encourage people. I'm like, don't, like, this is a legit 4-channel amp. Like those other channels aren't there just to give you options like that are, just kind of fill in the blanks. Like, no, each one stands on its own. It's, you can tell how much I love the amp. I literally do. Like it's,
you're out of your seat. You're just excited about it, man.
I am. It's my desert island amp, and I'm pumped up. Like I can have it anytime I want and on any system I want. It's pretty awesome.
It's incredible, man. Like I definitely want to play around with it a lot more, but it sounds great, man. So congrats on putting that out there, because I think a lot of people are going to pick up on it, and it's going to become that popular plugin that everyone needs. So
I hope so.
Awesome, man. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. Man, you just all the insight that you gave us today was incredible, and like I love just the way you described your process. It's like it's very clear, and the topic of intent has come up numerous times here, and it's very clear that intent is how you always think about things. So thank you again for being on this and providing so much awesome insight. If people want to learn more about you or follow you online, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, if they can go to my website if they want to get in contact with me directly, chrisbasford.com. I'm on kind of all the socials, Chris Basford, Facebook and Instagram. Instagram's probably what I'm on the most, so you can find me on there, DM me. And yeah, just that's probably the best way to do it, either my website or Instagram.
Awesome. And lastly, are there any cool projects that you're working on right now that you can talk about?
I just finished mixing the new Daughtry album, which is unbelievable. A really, really, really great album. I'm really excited about that coming out. I think a lot of people are going to dig it. It's got some heavier stuff than I think people are used to hearing from him, and really just an overall awesome album. So I think that's probably one that's done, going to be coming out probably around the time that this does. And then, we've started kind of getting the ball rolling on some new Nickelback material as well. So we've got that coming as well.
Amazing.
So,
awesome, man. Well, looking forward to hearing them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, again, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this, and keep up the great work, man. You're crushing it. Thanks.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Mike.
So that was my interview with Chris Basford, and that was awesome. I love the way he thinks. He's just so articulate with his process, and the topic of doing things with intent came up numerous times, and it's very clear that is exactly how he approaches everything. Just, you could tell by his answers that he really does think about every situation and have reason behind every move that he makes. So yeah, I love all the detail that he went into about creating wide mixes and how he goes about doing that. And also on the topic of samples, just like his approach for doing that as well. I think there's a lot of great lessons to take out of this episode. So Chris, if you're listening to this, thanks again for being on the podcast. Man, this was a lot of fun. And I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of this too. And for you, the listener, if this is your first time listening to this podcast, definitely make sure to subscribe to it so that you're up to date on all of the new episodes as they're released. And definitely make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. When you go to that website, there are a bunch of great resources. There's blogs, podcasts, books, courses, a whole bunch of great stuff to help you get very clear on the various tools and processes behind recording and mixing. But one resource that I would highly recommend you check out is called The Mixing Mindset. That is a Amazon #1 best-selling book that I put out a couple years ago. And inside that book, I walk you through my entire step-by-step process for creating pro-sounding mixes. So definitely make sure to check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that's available at MasterYourMix.com. So that is it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I really look forward to talking to you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.